thank you for the work that you do. Looking at some of the discussions from adverse childhood experiences to children in poverty, and of how we can provide better care for all of our kids, and moving on. We can talk about the state of the young child, but you're working and addressing and living it each and every day. And I think, as Commissioner Curtis says, and that does make a meaningful difference. And there are many different areas that I think that I could touch on, and that sometimes our paths cross. We know that if a child goes to school and wakes up in the morning without food, they're not going to be focusing on learning, they're going to be focusing on their empty tummy. It's great that in just the last 2 years, 41,000 more kids across our state now have a breakfast at school. We know that often the most vulnerable, that need most protection of our children, at times it seems that we as the state don't dedicate enough efforts. Our child protective system, case management, is still DOS. Black with a green flashing thing. As Representative Dudek actually carried a bill to put some significant, $3 million more into trying to better provide on the Child Protective Services framework. I know that the mental health needs of all of our kiddos, not just the youngest, but all throughout. How is it that we still are in a state where, for the last 30 years, we've been one of the top 5 states in the country for youth suicides? And even though that our native population is about 7% of the state, it's actually a higher number of suicides for our natives than across the board. All of these things you work on and you wrestle with and you grapple with to address. So the great thing about all of you is the state of the young child is always one where, no, we'll constantly be working on improving that, because that's what you do, and I'm very appreciative. So we could talk about a lot of different areas. I am going to touch briefly on, from my perspective, the importance of early childhood education, and it's one that I really wish I wasn't speaking to you about today, from the perspective of that I really wish I could be here saying, look at all the legislature accomplished and how it's going to make a difference in your community. And thank you, Crystal Burns, for everything that you did along that path to finally convince these folks that it is an important investment. Instead, I need to go back to almost where I've been for quite a while, and where I guess I'll continue to be for at least 2 more years, is trying to emphasize what so much many of you already know, and that's the benefit of getting our kids off on the right start. That if a child shows up not kindergarten ready, they're half as likely to be reading at grade level by the time they're in 3rd grade. And if you're not reading at grade level by the time you're in 3rd grade, that you're 4 times more likely to drop out of high school. And while we can celebrate the fact that we had the highest graduation rates in Montana since they started recording graduation rates last year, we also need to recognize that if that made sense, since we've been recording graduation rates, the highest percentage was last year. But we also have to recognize, too, that, 85% of the inmates at Montana State Prison didn't graduate from high school. And this is about both economic achievement, but also saving dollars on the backside from social services and correctional programs and others. And while, everywhere else this hasn't been a political issue, the reddest of red states, Oklahoma and Georgia and others, have said these are meaningful investments. And it's investments that the state needs to contribute to, because we know that if somebody's in a quality early childhood education program, that They're much less likely to become teenage parents, less likely to receive public assistance in the future, less likely to abuse drugs, less likely to end up in jail. That we know that for every dollar spent, and it's business folks and economists that have said, for a quality program, you know that there's going to be at least a $7 to $9 return. We know that they're more likely to be reading at grade level, contributing overall to the economy. And we know that ultimately the need exists. And we do the best we can in some areas. Certainly, Head Start is a valuable program. Across the state, there are as many kids on the waiting list for Head Start as there are served. We know that many communities have kind of taken this on their own and said, we'll cobble and figure out a way to do it. And you could go to Hardin and they'd say, we'll cut every other program we have now before we cut our early childhood education program. Because we've seen the intensive needs coming in and how they're kindergarten ready coming out. And we know that places like Crystal's and others, there's incredible programs all throughout our state. So this past session, I proposed funding for a voluntary program. Completely voluntary for the communities, completely voluntary for the individual 4-year-olds, with the thought that money and dollars would go to your locally elected Board of Trustees. And your locally elected school board could decide how much to expand it, not to do anything, and how all to go through it. So flexibility, if you want to do it in your school, fine. If you want to partner with great community providers that we already know exists, fine. If you want to do it to supplement and help and augment some of the efforts of Head Start, fine. And we did a lot of work on it. And businesses did a lot of work on it. Because the interesting thing is, if you look at the 44 states, at this point maybe it's 46, that have put state funding in for early childhood education, in so many of those states, it was led by business leaders. It was led by the chambers of commerce, and many local chambers, I think the Missoula Chamber endorsed this from the perspective of this does make a difference for our overall economic growth for our community. We didn't get there, and from my perspective, that there's a lot of really good things that happened this last legislative session. But this was a disappointment, and it's a disappointment where on the one hand we could say, well, actually in Oklahoma there are a little north of 70% of every 4-year-old is in a program where there's some public funding for, whether it's at a private institution or others. It took them over 20 years. The state of the young child, we don't have 20 years to say we should move this a little bit further. And it's an area where we do need an investment from the state. Now, one of the parts of this job that I have is trying to be a steward of taxpayer dollars. It's something that I take very, very seriously. And somehow you end up with having to manage about a $5 billion general fund budget over a 2-year period. And I think that we as community members and taxpayers want to make sure that the money that's taken from your pockets and sent to Helena to be distributed is used wisely. Arthur Rolnick, as some of us know, the Senior Vice President of the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis, said the best investment that we can make in economic development, the best investment in economic development that government and the private sector can make is in the healthy development of children. The work that you all do, the work that early childhood education would do. If he is to be believed, invest in early childhood programs, exactly the sort of investments that we should be making as a state as we look toward the long term. Done right, it certainly is a win-win scenario. Kids are more likely to achieve their potential. Employers are more likely to have that talent and trained workforce. States less likely to be spending as much money on corrections and safety net programs down the road. That's why we proposed, and working also with the superintendent, Juno, and others, to try to say, if we're going to ask for taxpayer dollars, let's ensure that there are quality standards in place. Not a curriculum, but what the great thing about as we look at the potential for public funding of preschool programs is, the only thing I can be optimistic about is being one of 4 or 6 states that haven't made these investments, is you don't really have to recreate the wheel. That there are some quality programs to draw from both in the state and out of the state. If I'm governor during the 2017 legislative session, you can, I guess, be sure that I'll continue to be working on this in early childhood education, and that money will be in my budget. Between now and then, it's where when I said I was really hoping at the start I wouldn't have to be talking about early childhood education. But for the next 2 years, this will certainly be one of the principal things I talk about, because I think it's no different than the work that each and every one of you do, is that 4-year-olds and 3-year-olds, and they don't have a constituency, right? They're not a powerful political bloc. They rely on each of you to actually be that voice. And it's each of you that engage in so many areas where we talk about the state of the young child, that will make sure that we as government officials are held accountable, doing everything that we should to promote the state of the young child. We as research communities and universities, we as providers all across will do so. I am confident that ultimately, as we do this work, as we continue to beat on this, that progress will be made. On the optimism side, also that the state of Montana received a $40 million grant, I think it's $10 million over the next 4 years, to do some targeted work in early childhood education. It's not to, essentially, that what we had asked for through Early Edge wouldn't have replaced that. It would have actually augmented and provided in a number of other areas. But targeted communities where we'll be able to continue the narrative of what significant investment can do for our kids, and continue to build off the voices from community providers like the Missoula Community School and programs that are existing. But as we know, that public policy and shaping public policy takes work. And the work that each and every one of you do for our young kiddos certainly matters, and you impact lives every single day. I'd ask you, as we go forward to the next legislative sessions and beyond, to also take some of that passion and advocacy and make sure that our lawmakers know what a difference that we can make by working a little bit harder on behalf of our youngest.